Welcome back, seniors. I hope you had a relaxing spring break, that you found some fun activities to do, spend some time with your family. But now it's time to get going with our fourth quarter. And yesterday you started with chapter 13 that looks at economic performance. Fourth quarter, our focus will be on macroeconomics. So let's start there. So during the third quarter, we studied microeconomics, where we looked at supply and demand and all the smaller units that make up our economy. With macroeconomics, we will be dealing with the big picture of our economy. I think some of you will find this a little bit easier. They tend to be concepts that if you watch the news, you do have some familiarity with. All right, so let's look at the gross domestic product. This is the big focus for this chapter and the activities that go along with this chapter. The gross domestic product is, you can read the definition, the total dollar value of all final goods and services produced in a country's borders during a given year. Basically, what we're measuring is all the different countries, or excuse me, all the different companies that were producing within the borders of the United States. What did they make? That's what we're looking at. So if it was a foreign company, but they were producing within the borders of the United States, we would count them. If it was an American company, but they were producing, for instance, in Mexico or Japan, we would not count them. This has to be business that is being done within the borders of our country. It's a very important measurement for many reasons. It really does give an indication of our standard of living. The reason being, if we go back to supply and demand and the profit incentive that we discussed in chapter 1 and again in chapter 5, we know businesses are driven to make money, and they will produce only that which will be bought. So a company isn't going to produce a good unless it's going to be purchased. So if companies are producing, it means there's a demand for the good. If there's a demand for the good, it means there is a consumer out there with money who is wanting to buy the good. So when our GDP goes up, that's a good thing, because people have money to buy things and they're putting a demand on businesses, and businesses are producing. So we can look at how well are we doing? What is our standard of living? If the GDP is going up, then our standard of living most likely is going up. Our economic performance is increasing. That's what we want. So GDP numbers are very important. To be able to compute the GDP, well, we won't do the math since we're not together, but mathematically, if you wanted to take an account of the GDP, what you would do is you would take all final goods and services produced in our country over a year, and we multiply them by their price, add everything up, and we're going to get a total dollar value. In terms of who first takes this measurement, we have the Bureau of Labor Statistics and government that is responsible for taking the GDP. But what they do is they do a scientific sampling. You might remember these from math. They know they can't figure out every single thing produced within our borders. It's not possible, especially considering they take this 4 times a year, so every 3 months. So they do a scientific sampling. They take various areas within our country, and then they're able to project out what our GDP was. Not everything is included in GDP, and we'll go over these because this will be important for the activity that you're going to do today to understand those things that are not included. The first thing that is not included in the GDP are intermediate goods. What that means are goods that are used to make another product. So for example, if you were making a car, and for example, maybe Goodyear sold Ford tires, Goodyear does not count those goods as part of what they sold to be counted in GDP, because those goods will eventually be counted when the car is sold. We don't sell goods until they're in their final state. That final state for those tires are on that Ford vehicle. So if Goodyear were to count them when they made them, and then Ford when they make the car, obviously within the figured into the price of the car, those tires, if both Goodyear and Ford were considering those tires as being produced, we now would have counted them twice. So we only count goods in their final state. So if you were to look at the goods that maybe go into a house, the windows, the electrical cords, the roof, all of that would be counted at the very end. That the roofer and the roofing company, they wouldn't count the roofing material because, again, it would be figured in the price of the house. So intermediate goods are the goods that go into making something. Those aren't counted until they meet their final state. The second thing not counted are secondhand goods. Basically what we're saying here are used goods. Used goods are not counted because they were first counted when they were made. They weren't made a second time. So if you buy something used, it is not counted. Underground economy is another exclusion. Underground economy means it would be activity or sales that would be illegal. If it is illegal, it is not officially counted in our economy. And then non-market transactions. These are exchanges of money where there's no record of it. So for example, if you lend somebody money and you're not writing up some official receipt that you're going to use to file your taxes, for instance, your parents give you money, that would fit here, or you loan $5 to a friend. If you like drop some money in a charity where it wasn't something that you were keeping track of for your tax purposes, that would also be non-market transactions. So those are our 4 major exclusions, and we want to do this and not include these things because we want the most accurate GDP numbers possible. When we look at GDP, we also know it's not going to be 100% accurate. Some of the concerns that make our GDP not 100% accurate is composition of output. Basically, what are we making? If you remember when you studied World War II, especially maybe even the Cold War, and we looked at what countries were making, they were making a lot more guns, a lot less butter. So if you looked at the composition of the GDP, it would be mainly military goods, not civilian goods. So we don't necessarily, we're not able to say with 100% accuracy that the standard of living is going up because the GDP went up, because we don't know what was produced necessarily, and did that really make an impact on the average person. Another issue with the GDP not being 100% correct is we've got to consider, did the GDP go up because the production of goods went up, or did the GDP go up because prices went up? So was there inflation? So we'll look at in a later section, how do we take the impact of inflation out of GDP? The next thing, distribution or quality of life. We know that they were made, but we don't know who received them. So we can say the GDP went up, more goods and services were produced, but did the average person in that population have access to those goods? Or were those goods made but then distributed only to the very wealthy, or were they distributed only to the middle class? That's what we're looking at with distribution or quality of life. There is another measurement that is sometimes used, not as frequent as in the past because of the amount of international trade we do that is similar to the GDP. It's called the GNP, or the gross national product. The difference with this measurement, GDP, if you remember, measures all goods and services produced within a country's borders during a year. The GNP, what is different about that, when we look at our GNP, we're looking at American companies' production for the year, whether or not that American company is located within the United States or in another country. That's what we're measuring with GNP. We're looking at American businesses and their production, whether or not they are in our country or outside of our country. So basically, the GDP and the GNP would be the same thing if we didn't let foreign companies operate within our country and we didn't allow American companies outside of our country to produce. But overall, they tend to run fairly similar in trend lines. Another concept in this chapter that we'll come back to discuss many times during macroeconomics is income, your personal income, and then your disposable personal income. A number of you have familiarity with this because you are holding down jobs. Your personal income is basically what you wish you were making. It is that income that it belongs to you before income taxes are taken out. The difference then with disposable income, your disposable personal income is after your taxes have been taken out. So your disposable personal income will be less than your personal income. The last thing that we have to look at today is the sectors that are added up to be able to figure out our GDP. The first sector we look at is consumer spending, and 2/3 of our GDP is made up of consumer spending, the average household and what we buy. We make up a majority of what is bought up in the economy. The other group that we're looking at and what they are buying in our economy is the government. As you guys know, our income taxes are given to the government, and then the government turns around and spends that money. So government spending also figures into the GDP. Investment sector, that would be businesses. So consumers are spending, the government is spending in our economy, and businesses are spending. So that business, they're the productive sector, they're what's making more and more goods. So with investment sector, we are looking at businesses, what they purchase, for example, an assembly line or new technology. And the last sector we look at is the foreign sector. To figure out our foreign sector, we have to look at our trade, and we've got to net them. We've got to take our exports and we have to minus our imports. Exports are good for our economy. They go into our GDP as a positive number. Those are the goods that are being made in the United States and sold in other countries. Imports are counted in the GDP, but they're subtracted out of our GDP. They go in as a negative. Imports are those things that we are buying from other countries. So those are, again, included in our GDP, but go in as a negative. Exports, those are positive. They are added within the GDP and go in as something that helps our GDP. So we've got to get that idea that exports are a positive when they are included in the GDP, imports are a negative. So those are our 4 sectors that look at the GDP. You'll be using this information also to complete your worksheet for today. So hopefully that was helpful. If you do have any other questions on GDP or any of the worksheet questions or your homework questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If I don't hear from you, have a nice day, and I'll check in later with you all.